On the morning of March 17, 1830, in the frigid waters of Carlingford Lough, County Louth, Ireland, a trained cormorant surfaced with something that would transform a missing person case into Ireland's most peculiar murder investigation. The bird, owned by Oyster dredger Padraig Malloy, had been trained to dive for coins and trinkets lost overboard, a common entertainment for fishing crews along the Irish coast. But on this St. Patrick's Day morning, the bird emerged with a gold locket clenched in its beak. Inside, a lock of auburn hair and an inscription, "To my beloved Michael. From your eternal Catherine, 1827. Catherine Brennan had been a widow for 3 years. Her husband Michael, a customs officer, had disappeared during a routine patrol of smuggling routes along the Lough in January 1827. The authorities had declared him lost to the treacherous waters, another victim of Ireland's unforgiving coastal duties. But the discovery of that locket, precisely 40 feet from where Michael Brennan had last been seen, would reveal something far more sinister than an accidental drowning. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone in Carlingford could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about how a fishing bird exposed a conspiracy of murder that reached into the highest levels of Irish customs enforcement, make sure to subscribe to Fierce Sermon and ring that notification bell. We're building a community of history seekers who refuse to let the darkest chapters of our past stay buried. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's return to the shores of Carlingford Lough, where the winter of 1830 was about to resurrect a secret 3 years in the making. The Ireland of 1830 existed in a state of barely suppressed tension. Catholic emancipation had passed just 1 year earlier, granting Irish Catholics the right to sit in Parliament, but centuries of economic oppression and religious discrimination had left deep wounds across the island. Carlingford, a fishing village at the mouth of the Lough separating County Louth from County Down, sat at the intersection of two worlds, the official British customs system and the thriving underground economy of smuggling. Carlingford Lough, a narrow glacial fjord stretching 12 miles inland, had served as a smuggling corridor since time immemorial. French brandy, tobacco, silk, and tea moved through these waters under cover of darkness, evading the customs houses that lined both shores. The British government, desperate for revenue to fund its expanding empire, had militarized customs enforcement. Officers carried weapons, commanded small vessels, and held the authority to search, seize, and arrest. Michael Brennan had been one of these officers. At 32 years old, he was known throughout Carlingford as a fair but incorruptible man, a dangerous combination in a place where the line between legal fisherman and smuggler blurred with the tide. His wife Catherine, just 28 when he disappeared, was the daughter of a prosperous merchant. Their marriage had been one of genuine affection, unusual for the time, and Michael wore the gold locket she'd given him on their wedding day without fail. The fishing community of Carlingford employed various methods to harvest the Lough's bounty. Oyster dredging, in particular, represented a significant industry. The technique involved dragging heavy metal frames along the bottom, scooping up oysters, shells, and whatever else lay in the sediment. But some dredgers, like Padraig Malloy, had developed a more unusual method. Malloy, a weathered fisherman of 45, had trained a cormorant, a diving bird native to Irish coasts, to retrieve small objects from the Lough bottom. The practice wasn't unprecedented. Chinese fishermen had used cormorants for centuries, and the technique had spread to Europe. Malloy's bird, which he'd named Cromwell as a dark joke, would dive on command, sometimes to depths of 30 or 40 feet, and return with coins, buttons, fishing hooks, trinkets that supplemented a fisherman's meager income. The winter of 1829 to 1830 had been particularly harsh. Ice formed along the Lough's edges, and fishing was dangerous work. Malloy had been working the waters near the old customs house, a stone building on the southern shore that had been partially abandoned after consolidation of customs operations. On that St. Patrick's Day morning, seeking to entertain himself during a slow fishing day, Malloy sent Cromwell down for what he assumed would be the usual detritus. What the bird brought up would crack open a case that the authorities had been eager to close. The disappearance of Michael Brennan in January 1827 had initially seemed straightforward, tragic, but straightforward. He had set out on the evening of January 23rd aboard a small customs cutter with 2 junior officers, Thomas Wickham and James Doherty, to investigate reports of smuggling activity near Greenore Point. A winter storm had rolled in unexpectedly, and when the vessel returned to port at dawn, Michael Brennan was not aboard. Wickham and Doherty told a consistent story. The storm had intensified near midnight. Brennan had been on deck, checking the anchor line when a wave struck the vessel. They heard a cry, rushed from the cabin, but found only darkness and churning water. They searched for 3 hours before the storm forced them to return to port. Brennan, they concluded, had been swept overboard and drowned. His body, like so many claimed by Irish waters, would never be recovered. Catherine Brennan had not accepted this explanation easily. She appeared before the magistrate of Dundalk, demanding a fuller investigation. Michael was born on these waters, she testified, her voice steady despite grief. He knew the weather, knew the tides. He would not have been on deck during a storm without securing himself. And why? Here she fixed Wickham with a stare that made observers uncomfortable. Why did you wait until dawn to report him missing? The magistrate, a Protestant landowner named Robert Fitzgerald, had been sympathetic but ultimately dismissive. Mrs. Brennan, I understand your grief makes you seek explanation where only tragedy exists. The sea takes men, even experienced men. Your husband's death, while untimely, was not suspicious. But Catherine had pressed further. She hired a local solicitor and began interviewing witnesses. A fisherman named Sean O'Malley came forward with curious testimony. He had been checking his nets near Greenore Point that same night. I saw the customs cutter, he stated in a deposition. But it wasn't moving like a vessel in distress. It was anchored, calm as could be. I saw 3 figures on deck, not 2, and I heard voices, arguing, voices, carrying over the water. This testimony was dismissed. O'Malley was known to supplement his fishing income with occasional smuggling. His word against 2 customs officers was worthless in the eyes of British law. Then there was the matter of Michael Brennan's service record. In the months before his disappearance, he had filed 3 formal complaints about irregularities in cargo inspections. Ships that should have been searched were waved through. Seizure reports were being altered. Brennan had documented instances where his fellow officers had been present at the docks when smuggling vessels departed, suggesting coordination rather than enforcement. His immediate superior, Chief Customs Officer William Ashford, had responded to these complaints with increasing irritation. Mr. Brennan seems more interested in investigating his colleagues than in performing his duties, Ashford wrote in one official memorandum. His accusations are undermining morale and suggest an unhealthy obsession with conspiracy. 2 weeks before his disappearance, Michael Brennan had written a letter to Catherine that she would later produce as evidence. In it, he wrote, "My darling Catherine, I fear I have stirred a nest of vipers. The corruption runs deeper than I imagined, and I suspect men in positions far above my own are implicated. I am compiling evidence that I will present to authorities in Dublin, bypassing local administration entirely. If anything should happen to me before I can do so, know that the documents are secured in a place only you could find." Catherine had never found those documents. After Michael's disappearance, their home had been subtly but thoroughly searched. Books were slightly out of place, floorboards showed marks of recent prying, and Catherine's jewelry box, which contained nothing of real value, had been opened and clumsily closed. The final troubling incident occurred at Michael Brennan's memorial service. Thomas Wickham, one of the officers present on the night of the disappearance, attended the service at St. Michael's Church. Multiple witnesses, including the parish priest Father Donovan, observed Wickham speaking with William Ashford in the churchyard. Their conversation, while too distant to hear clearly, was animated. Father Donovan later testified, "Mr. Wickham appeared distressed, even fearful." Chief Officer Ashford placed a hand on his shoulder in what might have been reassurance or might have been warning. When Wickham departed, his face was pale as churchyard marble. Within 6 months of Michael Brennan's disappearance, both Thomas Wickham and James Doherty had left customs service. Wickham relocated to London, citing family obligations. Doherty moved to Cork, where he took a position as a clerk with a shipping company. Neither man ever returned to Carlingford. The investigation, such as it was, closed. Catherine Brennan was left with her grief, her suspicions, and no body to bury. The community of Carlingford, pragmatic and weary, moved forward. Men died on the loch. Life continued, until a cormorant named Cromwell brought up a gold locket from 40 feet of dark water. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries buried in history. The discovery of that locket would trigger an investigation that exposed corruption reaching from Irish fishing villages all the way to London. Let's discover what happens next in this extraordinary case. Padraig Malloy stood in his dredging boat, staring at the locket in his calloused palm. The morning sun glinted off the gold, and even before opening it, Malloy felt the weight of significance. Cormorants brought up many things: hooks, coins, fragments of pottery. But never something like this. The craftsmanship was fine, expensive. The gold was real. He pried it open carefully. The lock of auburn hair was still vibrant, preserved by the locket's seal. The inscription was clear despite 3 years underwater: "To my beloved Michael, from your eternal Catherine, 1827. Malloy knew immediately what he held. Everyone in Carlingford knew about Michael Brennan. Everyone knew Catherine still wore black. And everyone knew that Michael Brennan had never removed that locket, not even to bathe. The fisherman marked the spot carefully, a practice learned from years of oyster dredging. He noted the position relative to the old customs house, the angle of the shore, the depth of the water. Then he rode directly to the constabulary. Constable Patrick Hughes initially treated the discovery with skepticism. 3 years had passed. The case was closed. But Catherine Brennan was a persistent presence in Carlingford society, and her family had influence. Hughes sent word to her home and to the magistrate's office in Dundalk. Catherine arrived within the hour. When Hughes presented the locket, her composure, maintained through 3 years of widowhood, finally shattered. She confirmed through tears that this was the locket she had given Michael. "He wore it always," she whispered. "He told me it kept me close to his heart. He would never have removed it voluntarily." The implications hung unspoken in the small constabulary office. If Michael Brennan had drowned accidentally, swept overboard by a wave as officially reported, his body might have decomposed or been carried by currents, but the sealed gold locket would have remained fastened around his neck. The only way this locket could be free, lying on the bottom of the lock precisely where Brennan had disappeared, was if it had been torn or cut from his body. Magistrate Robert Fitzgerald, the same official who had dismissed Catherine's concerns 3 years earlier, arrived from Dundalk by noon. The discovery clearly disturbed him. He authorized an immediate expanded search of the area where Cromwell had found the locket. Over the next 3 days, a team of divers, professionals brought from Dublin at considerable expense, combed the lock bottom. The water was murky with sediment, visibility nearly zero, and the work was dangerous. But on the third day, March 20th, 1830, the divers found what everyone had begun to fear. Entangled in fishing nets and weighted down with chains was a skeleton. The remains were incomplete. 3 years of water, currents, and scavengers had done their work, but enough remained for identification. The skull showed a devastating fracture above the right temple. The ribs exhibited marks consistent with knife wounds, and around the neck, severed clean, was the chain that had once held Catherine Brennan's locket. Most damning of all were the chains themselves. They were standard-issue customs equipment, used for securing cargo during inspections. The divers recovered approximately 40 pounds of chain, more than enough to ensure a body would never surface. The recovery was methodical and documented. Dr. Ephraim Walsh, the chief physician of County Louth, examined the remains at the dockside. His preliminary assessment was unequivocal. The skull fracture alone would have been fatal. The angle and force suggest the individual was struck while standing or kneeling. The marks on the ribs indicate repeated stabbing, at least 6 separate wounds. This was not an accident. This was not drowning. This was murder, deliberate and brutal. Catherine Brennan identified her husband's remains through 3 specific details: a healed fracture on the left femur from a childhood riding accident, an unusual tooth configuration that her husband's dentist confirmed, and a silver ring that Michael had worn on his right hand, inherited from his father. The ring, engraved with the Brennan family crest, was still on the skeletal finger. The news spread through Carlingford like fire through dry thatch. Within 24 hours, every resident knew that Michael Brennan had not drowned. He had been murdered, weighted with chains, and dumped into the lough by someone with access to customs equipment. The question was no longer whether Michael Brennan had died accidentally. The question was who had killed him and how far the conspiracy reached. The investigation that followed would become one of the most politically sensitive cases in Irish legal history. The Dublin Castle Administration, which governed Ireland on behalf of the British Crown, recognized immediately that a murdered customs officer, killed by his own colleagues in all likelihood, represented a profound threat to British authority in Ireland. Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Duke of Northumberland, appointed a special prosecutor, Sir Edmund Barrett, a barrister known for his ruthlessness and his Protestant loyalty. Barrett arrived in Carlingford on March 25th with a team of investigators, legal clerks, and a detachment of constabulary forces. The first challenge was locating Thomas Wickham and James Doherty, the two officers who had been aboard the vessel the night Michael Brennan disappeared. Wickham was found in London, working as a clerk in a shipping office. When Barrett's men appeared at his boarding house, Wickham's response was telling. He did not express surprise at their presence. He did not ask why investigators from Ireland had traveled to question him. He simply said, "I've been expecting you." Doherty proved more difficult to locate. He had left Cork 6 months after arriving there and had, according to records, boarded a ship to Boston. Whether he received warning of the investigation or simply fled from guilt remained unclear. Despite extensive efforts, including correspondence with American authorities, Doherty was never apprehended. Thomas Wickham, however, broke under interrogation with surprising speed. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was fear of the gallows. Perhaps it was relief at finally unburdening himself. Regardless of motivation, within 3 days of his arrest, Wickham provided a full confession. The statement he gave, witnessed by Sir Edmund Barrett and 2 magistrates, detailed a conspiracy that reached beyond simple murder into systematic corruption. According to Wickham's testimony, Chief Customs Officer William Ashford had been coordinating with smuggling operations for more than 5 years. Ships carrying contraband paid substantial bribes to avoid inspection. Ashford distributed these bribes among trusted officers, ensuring their loyalty and silence. Michael Brennan, incorruptible and increasingly suspicious, had become a threat. His formal complaints, his documentation, his intention to report directly to Dublin authorities, all of this had been known to Ashford through informants within the local administration. Ashford had made the decision that Brennan needed to be eliminated. On the night of January 23, 1827, there had been no storm. The weather had been cold but clear. Ashford had sent Wickham and Doherty out with Brennan under the pretense of investigating smuggling activity. The actual purpose was murder. Doherty struck him first, Wickham testified, his voice hollow. With a belaying pin across the head, Michael collapsed, stunned but still breathing. Ashford had given us specific instructions: make certain he doesn't survive, and make certain he's never found. Doherty stabbed him repeatedly. I couldn't. I stood there frozen, but I helped with the chains afterward. We wrapped him in fishing net, bound the chains around him and pushed him overboard. We watched him sink, and then we anchored there for 3 hours to establish our story about the storm. The locket, Wickham explained, had been torn from Brennan's neck during the struggle. In the darkness and confusion, they had not realized it had fallen. It had simply slipped between the deck boards and into the water, landing on the bottom near where they disposed of the body. Ashford paid us each £50, Wickham continued. He said it was for a year's loyalty and future silence. He arranged our transfers away from Carlingford, said it would be safer if we weren't around when questions were asked, but he promised that the case would be closed quickly, that no one would care about one dead customs officer. The statement was damning, but it was also the testimony of an accomplice attempting to save his own neck by implicating others. Barrett needed corroboration. He found it in unexpected places. A search of William Ashford's office and home revealed coded ledgers documenting years of bribery payments. More than 20 smuggling operations had been paying regular fees to ensure safe passage through Carlingford Lough. The amounts were substantial, thousands of pounds annually. Ashford's personal wealth, which had grown conspicuously over the years, now had an explanation. Additional witnesses emerged. Ship's captains, under promise of immunity, confirmed the bribery arrangement. Several local merchants admitted they had paid Ashford for favorable customs treatment. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. It encompassed not just Carlingford but extended to customs operations throughout County Louth and into County Down. Ashford himself was arrested on April 3, 1830. Unlike Wickham, he refused to confess. He maintained absolute denial, insisting that Wickham's testimony was the desperate fabrication of a guilty man. "I am being made a scapegoat for a crime I did not commit," Ashford stated during his arraignment. "The word of a confessed murderer is being accepted over the service record of a decorated customs officer." But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The chains used to weight Brennan's body were traced directly to Ashford's warehouse. Financial records showed that Wickham and Doherty had each deposited exactly £50, significant sums for junior customs officers, within a week of Brennan's disappearance. And the timing of Wickham and Doherty's transfers, both arranged personally by Ashford, aligned with the cover-up. The trial of William Ashford began in Dublin on July 12, 1830, and lasted 3 weeks. It became a sensation throughout Ireland and England. Newspapers covered every detail. The courtroom was packed daily with observers, including members of Parliament interested in the case's political implications. The prosecution, led by Sir Edmund Barrett, presented a meticulous case. They detailed Ashford's corruption, his motivation to silence Brennan, and his coordination of the murder. They produced witnesses who testified to Ashford's growing paranoia about Brennan's investigation. They presented the physical evidence, the chains, the ledgers, the financial records. The defense attempted to discredit Wickham's testimony, painting him as the actual mastermind who was now attempting to shift blame. They argued that a customs officer of Ashford's standing and reputation would not risk everything for bribery schemes. They suggested that Brennan's death, while certainly murder, was the spontaneous act of Wickham and Doherty, not a planned assassination. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On August 2, 1830, they returned a verdict, guilty of conspiracy to murder. William Ashford was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on September 15, 1830, at Mountjoy Prison in Dublin. Contemporary accounts describe Ashford as defiant to the end, maintaining his innocence even as the noose was placed around his neck. Thomas Wickham, in exchange for his testimony, received a sentence of 20 years hard labor. He was transported to Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania, where he would die of dysentery in 1834, never completing his sentence. James Doherty was tried in absentia and convicted of murder. Warrants for his arrest remained active, but he was never found. Some historians believe he died in America under an assumed name. Others suggest he may have returned to Ireland decades later, living quietly in a remote village where no one knew his past. The broader corruption within the Irish Customs Service prompted extensive reforms. Dublin Castle launched investigations into customs operations throughout Ireland, uncovering similar though less lethal corruption in several ports. More than 30 customs officers were dismissed or prosecuted. New oversight mechanisms were implemented, including regular audits and rotating assignments to prevent officers from developing long-term relationships with local smuggling operations. Catherine Brennan finally had her husband's remains. She buried him in St. Michael's Churchyard on October 1, 1830, nearly 4 years after his death. The tombstone she commissioned read, Michael James Brennan, 1795 to 1827, murdered for his honor. Justice, though delayed, arrived. Beneath this inscription, she had carved, Truth, like the Cormorant, dives deep but always surfaces. She never remarried. She lived another 43 years, dying in 1873 at the age of 71. Local legend suggests she visited her husband's grave every single day of those 43 years, regardless of weather. She became a symbol in Carlingford and throughout County Lough, a woman who had refused to accept injustice, who had pressed for truth when authorities dismissed her, and who had ultimately been vindicated. The Carlingford murder case sent reverberations through Irish society and British colonial administration that extended far beyond the immediate convictions. The case arrived at a critical moment in Irish history, just 1 year after Catholic emancipation, when questions of British governance, Irish autonomy, and institutional corruption were at the forefront of political consciousness. The most immediate impact was on British colonial administration throughout the empire. If corruption could reach such depths in a relatively small Irish customs operation, what was occurring in India, the Caribbean, Australia, and other colonial holdings? The case prompted the British Parliament to commission a comprehensive review of colonial administrative practices. The resulting report, published in 1832, documented widespread corruption and led to significant reforms in how colonial offices were managed, audited, and overseen. Within Ireland specifically, the case became a rallying point for those advocating for Irish self-governance. Nationalist leaders like Daniel O'Connell cited the Brennan murder as evidence that British colonial administration was fundamentally corrupt and unaccountable. When a good man is murdered for his integrity, O'Connell declared in Parliament, and his murder is nearly successful in its concealment, what confidence can the Irish people have in British justice? The case featured prominently in Home Rule debates throughout the 1830s and 1840s. The Catholic Church in Ireland also seized upon the case. Michael Brennan was Catholic, William Ashford was Protestant. The religious dimension of the case, a Catholic officer murdered by Protestant superiors, fed into existing sectarian tensions. While historians debate whether religion was truly a motivating factor in Brennan's murder, the evidence suggests corruption and self-preservation were the primary motives. The perception of religious persecution became embedded in the case's popular memory. The role of Catherine Brennan in securing justice for her husband became legendary. At a time when women had virtually no legal standing, when widows were expected to quietly accept tragedy and move forward, Catherine had fought for years against institutional indifference. Her persistence inspired a generation of Irish women. Several early feminist writers in Ireland, including Anna Doyle Wheeler, cited Catherine Brennan as an example of female courage and determination. Perhaps most remarkably, the case established legal precedent for reopening closed investigations based on new physical evidence. Before the Brennan case, the general legal practice was that once a case was officially closed and a determination made, only extraordinary circumstances could justify reopening it. The discovery of the locket by Malloy's Cormorant and the subsequent successful prosecution established that physical evidence could override previous official conclusions. This precedent influenced British and Irish law for decades and was cited in numerous subsequent cases. The case also had an unexpected impact on natural history and animal training. The story of Cromwell the Cormorant capturing public imagination led to increased interest in trained birds throughout Britain and Ireland. Several scholarly papers were published examining the cognitive abilities of cormorants and other diving birds. The practice of training cormorants for practical purposes, while never widespread in Ireland, experienced a brief surge in popularity. Malloy himself became something of a celebrity and made a modest income giving demonstrations of Cromwell's abilities at fairs and gatherings. The smuggling trade along Carlingford Lough, while not eliminated by the Brennan case, was significantly disrupted. The increased scrutiny, the rotation of customs officers, and the implementation of new auditing procedures made corruption more difficult and dangerous. Some smuggling operations relocated to other areas, others reduced their activities. The legitimate fishing industry in Carlingford benefited from this reduction in competition and from improved relations with newly reformed customs operations. In terms of criminology and investigation techniques, the Brennan case is studied as an early example of successful cold case investigation. The combination of persistent advocacy, from Catherine, forensic evidence, the skeletal remains, documentary evidence, the ledgers and financial records, and testimony from an accomplice Wickham created an investigative model that influenced detective work throughout the 19th century. Several detective manuals published in the 1840s and 1850s reference the Brennan case as exemplary. The case also raised troubling questions about institutional cover-up that remain relevant. Magistrate Robert Fitzgerald, who initially dismissed Catherine's concerns, faced no official consequences despite his obvious failure to properly investigate. This reality, that those who enabled the cover-up through negligence or complicity faced no accountability, troubled contemporary observers and continues to trouble historians. It highlighted how corruption requires not just active participation but also passive acceptance from institutions designed to prevent it. Modern historians have examined the Brennan case as a window into 19th-century Irish life. The case documentation provides extraordinary detail about daily life in coastal communities, the economics of fishing and smuggling, the social dynamics between Catholic and Protestant populations, the status of women, and the machinery of British colonial administration. Academic papers continue to be published analyzing various aspects of the case. The physical locations associated with the case have become points of historical interest. St. Michael's Church, where Michael Brennan is buried, maintains a small plaque describing his murder and the subsequent investigation. The site of the old customs house near where Cromwell found the locket is marked with a commemorative stone. Local historical societies in Carlingford offer tours focusing on the case, and it features prominently in regional history museums. Perhaps most poignantly, the case serves as a reminder of how easily truth can be buried and how much courage is required to resurrect it. Michael Brennan would have remained officially drowned, his murder successful, if not for three factors: a trained bird's instinct to retrieve shiny objects, a widow's refusal to accept official explanations, and one officer's guilt-driven confession. Remove any one of these elements, and William Ashford would have lived out his life as a respected customs official, wealthy from corruption, his crime undetected. The case asks uncomfortable questions about how many other injustices remain buried, literal and figurative, because the combination of evidence, courage, and chance necessary to expose them never materialized. What do you think drove William Ashford to such an act? Was it purely greed, or was there something darker at work? A colonial administrator who saw an Irish Catholic officer as expendable, a man whose integrity threatened a system built on corruption. Leave your theories in the comments below. And what about Catherine Brennan? In a world that offered women no power, no legal standing, no voice in matters of justice, she refused to be silent. She fought for 3 years against institutional indifference and nearly won vindication through sheer persistence. Even before the locket surfaced, she had established that something was wrong. Her courage deserves to be remembered. If stories like this, forgotten chapters of history where ordinary people confronted extraordinary evil, resonate with you, subscribe to Fear Sermon. We're committed to bringing these lost narratives back into the light, to ensuring that victims are remembered and that courage is honored. Share this video with someone who appreciates dark history and the strange ways truth emerges. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. In our next investigation, we'll examine another case where the past refused to stay buried. A very different story, but one that shares the same core truth: justice, delayed or denied, always leaves traces. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for being part of this community of history seekers. See you in the next video.